Early in the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John D. Waldron broke from the planned course to hunt for the enemy. While other squadrons followed a different heading, he trusted his instincts and led his men on their own path. When smoke appeared on the horizon, confirming the presence of 3 Japanese carriers, Waldron knew the other American aircraft were too far behind to help. His squadron would face the enemy alone. The American TBD Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 lined up their attack run. Outdated and outpaced, their slow-moving aircraft were no match for the swift Zero fighters circling above, or the walls of anti-aircraft fire rising from the Japanese fleet. Despite their slim chances of survival, they pressed forward. Waldron had made a promise earlier, and his words still echoed in the squadron's mind, quote, "We'll get them." Rise and fall. When the Douglas Torpedo Bomber, or TBD, entered service in 1937, it was a groundbreaking addition to the United States Navy. At a time when biplanes still operated alongside modern monoplanes, the service's first all-metal monoplane torpedo bomber introduced features that set a new standard for carrier-based aircraft. Its fully enclosed cockpit, folding wings, and retractable landing gear were all designed with practicality and efficiency in mind. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R1830-64 twin-wasp radial engine delivering 850 horsepower, the model could reach a top speed of 206 miles per hour and a range of 435 miles. Just over 35 feet long and with a wingspan of 50 feet, the model was big enough for a crew of 3, a pilot, a bombardier/radio operator, and a rear gunner. For armament against the Axis powers, the TBD featured a forward-firing 30 caliber machine gun for offensive strikes and a rear defensive gun. Inside the bomb bay was a single Mark 13 torpedo, the primary and newly developed weapon for ship attacks, or up to 1,200 pounds of bombs for striking ground and naval targets. But despite all its great features, as aircraft innovation in the 1930s surged ahead at breakneck speed, by the time World War II was in full swing in other parts of the world, the once cutting-edge design was now painfully outdated, and its weaknesses were glaring. The aircraft's top speed was no match for the swift Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, which soared past at over 330 miles per hour, while her modest armament fell short against more heavily armed enemy aircraft. Lacking essential World War II features like armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, this once prized aircraft was dangerously exposed to enemy fire and lost ground to faster, more advanced designs. Aware that their once revolutionary model was already being eclipsed, only a few years after its introduction, by 1939, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics launched a competition for its replacement, culminating in the selection of the Grumman TBF Avenger. But as the Avenger began development, the aging TBD soldiered on as the Navy's frontline torpedo bomber. The Devastator in the Pacific. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the aircraft was thrust into combat. Just in time for its baptism of fire, the TBD earned the name Devastator. In February 1942, TBD Devastators from USS Enterprise roared into action, targeting Japanese shipping in the Gilbert Islands. From the get-go, the mission faced steep challenges as crews wrestled with the unreliable Mark 13 torpedo. This fragile weapon demanded pinpoint precision, dropped no higher than 120 feet, and no faster than 150 miles per hour, leaving the aircraft dangerously vulnerable to enemy fire during these slow, low-altitude runs. Even when launched correctly, the Mark 13 often failed to deliver. Bombardiers often stayed behind, reducing weight and risk, but leaving the Devastator with just a 2-man crew to brave the dangerous approach. Through the spring of 1942, the Devastators saw action in raids on Wake and Marcus Islands, and against Japanese forces near New Guinea. Results were mixed, with every mission a test of both pilot skill and sheer luck. Despite her obsolescence, the torpedo bomber didn't just fall into obscurity. In early May 1942, Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, commander of Task Force 17, then located west of the main Allied base of Noumea, received intelligence reports that a Japanese detachment was headed for Tulagi Harbor in the Solomon Islands. According to the leader, quote, "This was just the kind of report we'd been waiting 2 months to receive." The next day, a dozen TBD Devastators from USS Yorktown joined coordinated airstrikes on Japanese forces at Tulagi, helping sink several ships and damaging others. Though successful, the strikes came at a cost, as they revealed the presence of U.S. carriers in the area, prompting Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi's carrier strike force to accelerate their search for the nearby Allied forces, ready to destroy them no matter the cost. Target spotted. In the early morning of May 7th, Allied reconnaissance planes spotted Shoho, a light aircraft carrier of the Zuiho class that carried up to 35 aircraft on her deck. This massive ship was a key asset in spearheading Japanese operations to secure Port Moresby, New Guinea. That day, escorted by a powerful force of cruisers and destroyers, she provided air cover for the invasion fleet. Recognizing the critical importance of neutralizing the carrier, Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher ordered an all-out strike. As aircraft scrambled from 2 carriers, 13 Devastators from USS Lexington and 12 from USS Yorktown took off into the fray, each armed with a single Mark 13 torpedo. The technology's unreliability surely weighed heavily on the pilots' minds as they approached their target. At 10:40 a.m., the coordinated Allied strike force descended upon the Japanese light carrier, a mix of Devastators and SPD Dauntless bombers zeroing in on their target. With only 2 outdated Mitsubishi A-5M fighters and a lone Mitsubishi Zero to defend her, the crew aboard Shoho faced odds stacked impossibly against her, as the full force of American air power bore down on them. With this, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier battle in history, was about to begin. Eyes on the prize. Approaching Shoho at 11 a.m., a group of SPD Dauntless dive bombers initiated their assault from high altitude, diving directly toward the carrier to distract its anti-aircraft defenses. Their 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs found their mark, crashing through the Japanese carrier's decks. As explosions rocked Shoho, damaging her flight deck and igniting a fire, the Devastators began a powerful run of their own. Flying low and dangerously slow, just above the waves, the crews aboard their Devastators had their eyes set on Shoho's vulnerable hull. Within seconds of beginning their approach, flak erupted around the incoming aircraft, and machine guns from the enemy and her loyal escorts unleashed torrents of fire. Nonetheless, the American pilots pressed forward and released 5 torpedoes on the already beleaguered Shoho within the crucial 2,000-yard range. At least 2 hit the carrier, one slamming into her starboard side near the engine room, causing devastatingly catastrophic flooding. Smoke poured from Shoho as her crew fought in vain to save the ship. Within minutes, her engines were failing and her defenses in disarray, just as the Devastator pilots, having completed their runs, banked sharply away, dodging anti-aircraft bursts and gunfire from the retreating Japanese escorts. By 11:35 a.m., less than 40 minutes after the attack began, Shoho was gone, slipping beneath the waves. Returning to their carriers, the U.S. pilots were greeted as heroes. Aboard an SPD Dauntless, Lieutenant Commander Dixon sent a brief but triumphant message that has since become iconic, quote, "Scratch one flat top." The sinking of Shoho was a pivotal moment for the Americans, marking the first Japanese carrier lost in the war and a major morale boost for the U.S. Navy, all of which would have never happened without the teamwork of the Douglas TBD Devastator and the Douglas SPD Dauntless. Only a day later, a second U.S. carrier strike, which included more than 20 TBDs, attempted to attack 2 larger Japanese carriers. And while the trusty SBDs, considered the best dive bombers of the entire conflict, inflicted significant damage on the 2 ships, no torpedoes from the Devastators scored hits, and neither Japanese ship was sunk. The Battle of Midway. Fresh off the sinking of Shoho at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Douglas TBD Devastator was called back into action just a month later. By then, the Devastator's reputation forced the Navy to severely reduce the force, with only 41 aircraft available across 3 carriers. June 4th, 1942 dawned with a powerful sense of urgency as United States naval forces in the Pacific prepared to counter a massive Japanese fleet determined to destroy Midway, a small atoll that served as a critical military outpost for aircraft and ships alike, and the remaining American carriers near it. With Admiral Chester Nimitz's strategy relying on an ambush, all squadrons, including the troubled Devastators, had their part to play. At first light, the USS Hornet's air group launched toward the enemy. Among them was Torpedo Squadron 8, or VT-8. Led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, 15 Devastators were tasked with striking Japanese carriers shielded by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. As the planes roared into the air, the multi-level plan was clear. Dive bombers would attack from above, and just like with Shoho, the Devastator torpedo bombers would target the carriers' hulls. Leader Waldron, knowing the odds were stacked against them aboard their painfully slow models, and armed with the more than unreliable torpedo, briefed his men to do their duty with all they had. However, disagreement over the enemy's position led Waldron to break the formation. Trusting his instincts, the lieutenant commander veered his men toward where he believed the Japanese carriers would be, all performed under radio silence. By 9:25 a.m., smoke on the horizon confirmed their target. 3 Japanese carriers, their decks bustling with aircraft, preparing for a massive attack. But the other Allied aircraft had not arrived just yet. Nonetheless, Waldron transmitted the enemy's location and made his decision. VT-8 would attack, even without support. He signaled the squadron to tighten formation and descend, preparing for their torpedo runs. Within moments, the sky erupted as the much faster Japanese Zero fighters descended on VT-8, their guns blazing. The Devastators, flying at just 206 miles per hour, stood little chance against them. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and their escorts filled the air with explosions and shrapnel. One by one, the Devastators were struck, plummeting into the water. No way out. According to Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding the aircraft carrier Hornet, which became a helpless witness to the carnage unfolding in the skies, he described the attack, quote, beset on all sides by the deadly Zero fighters who were doggedly attacking them in force, and faced with a seemingly impenetrable screen of cruisers and destroyers, the squadron dove in valiantly at short range. Plane after plane was shot down by fighters. Anti-aircraft bursts were searing faces and tearing out chunks of fuselage, and still the squadron bore in. Those who were left dropped their torpedoes at short range. Waldron's Devastator was among the first hit. Its fuel tank ruptured in a blaze, and while the valiant lieutenant commander tried to maintain control, his aircraft disappeared into the waves. As the rest of the squadron surged ahead, Ensign George Gay, one of VT-8's youngest pilots, pushed his Devastator to the release point, aiming for the carrier Soryu. He released his torpedo and pulled up, but his aircraft was torn apart by bullets, making it spiral down into the ocean. Struggling free from the wreckage, an injured but alive Gay grabbed a floating seat cushion and hid beneath it, forced to watch the chaos unfold from the relative safety of the water. Their attack, though costly, was not in vain. The Zeros, drawn to intercept VT-8, abandoned higher altitudes to engage the low-flying TBD Devastators, while the Japanese carriers were forced into evasive maneuvers that disrupted their operations. This untimely chaos cleared the way for American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, which arrived relatively unnoticed minutes later. With the enemy Zeros out of position and anti-aircraft defenses well occupied with the helpless Devastators, the Dauntless crews struck with great precision, hitting Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Despite their heroism, none of VT-8's torpedoes struck their targets, and young Gay emerged as the squadron's sole survivor. A staggering 37 TBDs were lost on June 4, 1942, along with 32 pilots and 35 enlisted crewmen. Meanwhile, not a single one of their 41 torpedoes launched struck their targets, and these painful losses marked the last major combat for the Devastator. For VT-8, June 4th was a mission of courage and sacrifice. Their actions, though costly, paved the way for a decisive victory that completely turned the tide of the Pacific War. Only a day later, 3 TBD Devastators from USS Enterprise took off from their carrier, with the task of striking the damaged Japanese heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami. Carefully approaching under heavy anti-aircraft fire, the models were simply unable to penetrate the fierce defenses, and facing overwhelming odds, the pilots released their torpedoes prematurely to avoid certain destruction and turned back to the carrier. This brief and unsuccessful sortie ended the TBD Devastator's operational career. Unceremonious end. While the Battle of Midway was the first decisive win for the United States Navy in the Pacific, The same could not be said for the personal history of the Douglas TBD Devastator. After the type's grueling losses during the battle, the Navy retired all its remaining Devastators, replacing them with the more advanced Grumman TBF Avenger. The surviving 39 models were relegated to training roles stateside, and by 1944, the aircraft had vanished entirely from Navy service. Even today, no complete Devastator models exist in museums or personal collections. All remaining examples rest underwater. Much of the type's struggles stemmed from the deeply flawed design of the early U.S. Mark 13 torpedo. During the war, Devastators launched around 95 torpedoes, achieving limited success. 7 struck the Japanese carrier Shoho, while 3 hits sank a destroyer and damaged 2 cargo ships. Some horizontal bombing runs against cargo vessels caused additional damage, but their overall impact was quite poor, as most of the time, these weapons often failed to detonate, ran too deep, or missed their targets entirely, forcing pilots to make dangerously low and slow attack runs. Amongst military aviation circles, the Devastator is often labeled a failure. Still, its shortcomings stemmed less from design flaws and more from the pace of technological progress, leaving it outclassed on the modern battlefield. And the type's replacement was already under development before its career came to an abrupt end. Though its operational life was brief and marred by heavy losses, the TBD bridged the gap between pre-war designs and the battle-hardened aircraft that would eventually dominate and help win during the later years of World War II.